Welcome back. Now let's get into the next part of the class, which is going to be dealing with ways to get third-party control components. Remember, we're looking at the video distribution in the room now, and we want to get some sort of control over those two displays in the room and that wireless presentation device. But we don't make any of those, so we need some sort of third-party control. And there's two ways that we can really establish that. We can use user components, or we can use plugins. In this case, we'll use both. We'll be using user components for the two displays, and we'll be using a plugin for that wireless presentation device. I'm going to jump back into the schematic here, and we're going to take a look first at user components. Now, user components can certainly be used to control third-party devices, but that's not always the case. Really, they're just a collection of different components within a design that are saved in their state that they're working in. So, for example, I could create one right now within a few seconds. It's really that easy to just create a user component. Let's say for some reason I have some colleagues who just are really liking my logic from my UCI layer controller connect a USB device, and they really want to use it. Well, I could just take everything that I've already created, I could highlight all of it, and if I drag it over here to the right side where it says user components, you'll see it says create new user component. So I release, I can name it whatever I want. This is Jake's logic creative name. If I hit OK, immediately, if I don't have something in the search bar, you'll see that down at the bottom here, there it is, user components, Jake's logic. If I drag that in, you'll see it is a direct copy of everything that we have right there on the left.
I use user components all the time. If you have something in your design that you know you're going to do multiple times, like the processing of a mic chain or something like that, save it as a user component. That way the next time you need to bring in that same microphone, you just grab your user component and you use that. It saves you a lot of time. However, in this case, if someone were to create a user component that controls a third-party device, then they might save that as a user component, and that's what we're going to use in order to control our displays.
That's right. In fact, if Nate was really interested in what I just created and he needed that user component itself, it would be really easy for me to share it, because when I created it in Designer, not only was it available for me in that folder, but if I jump into the Q-SYS Designer folder in my documents, there's our styles folder we were working with earlier. Just below that, there's user components folder. If I open that up, there it is, a file that is Jake's logic, and then I can share that however I need to with whoever I need to. They could throw that into their user component folder, and then they would be able to use it in any of their designs. It's that easy to share a user component or create a basic one, I suppose. But we're going to actually use a little one that's a little bit more complicated for our two displays. In the folder that you should have downloaded at the beginning of class, there will also be a link below this video for this specific user component. We have the Kolarchik TV control. You can always tell if it's a user component when you look at the type file it is over here on the right. We're going to use this one. It's really easy to install. You could either copy it, put it into that same folder we were just looking at in Designer, or you could just double-click it. If I double-click it, you'll see it says install Q-SYS user component Kolarchik TV control. Yes. So I'll hit yes. And already there it is down at the bottom of my screen under user components, Kolarchik TV control. Go ahead and drag two of those in to the displays area because we have two displays. And if we open it up, we can see what we have here, Kolarchik televisions. Now we have a few different controls that have been given to us, an on and off button. We have some configurations that we will need to set up, the IP address and the port. In fact, we could do that right now. Right over here, you'll see this displays information. Right here we have the two displays and the IP addresses and the ports that we'll need in order to get them working properly. So let's go ahead and put that in right now so we can make sure that our emulator works correctly as we move forward. So left display is 127.0.0.1, and the port is 5101. And then for that second one, 127.0.0.1,
Now, savvy people out there may be wondering why these two TVs have the same IP address. You're correct, that would never happen in the real world. That's not possible. If you know a little bit about networking, then you know that 127.0.0.1 is a loopback IP address. So essentially, we're telling our laptops to look at itself, literally look at itself, where it will find the emulator that is running this inside of our UCI. Speaking of which, let's test that right now. Do this yourself. Get your design to a place where you can see those user components on screen at the same time as the emulator. I'll just leave the lights off. See if the TVs turn on and off. You should see that if you turn them on, there's my left display turns on. I can turn that on and off. The right side turns on and off. I can turn both of them on or off. If yours is not doing that, then you probably have the wrong IP address or the ports, so double check that. You want to make sure it works now before you do the rest of the control. Just like you would in the real world. Make sure that it actually works.
All right. So we have the two components. Before we move on and start talking about some plugins, I do want to point out a few downsides to user components. First of all, something you may notice, these on and off buttons could be pretty useful. If I drag that out of the component, if I wanted to put it somewhere else, it literally drags out of the component. It doesn't copy and drag out like most of the controls that you're used to in Designer. It is just one version of it that moves wherever you take it. Also, it's not all that easy to keep up with the newest version of a user component. Most likely you've received it from someone or you've gotten it somewhere. You're not going to get an update letting you know there's a newer version of that user component, so you'll just be working with whatever you have. Now, on the other hand, we have plugins. Plugins are a bit more complicated. In fact, I'm not going to show you how to build one because I don't know how. It's much more complicated to create your own plugin. Luckily, we actually have a library built into Designer. You're probably familiar with the Asset Manager. You can access that using the puzzle icon right here next to Plugins. And here we will see a solid library of many Q-SYS supported plugins that you can use for third-party control. In fact, this is where we're going to get the plugin that we're going to be using, the Immersive Solstice Pod. So go ahead, in the search bar, you can search for Immersive. There it is, right there. I already have it installed. You should see a button there that says install if you don't have it installed yet. It should take just a second or two. On the right-hand side, we can see we can download different versions if we want to download an earlier version. It gives us a description of the actual box itself and the hardware. We have a picture, and then we can see what it looks like in Designer as well when we're looking at its controls. One benefit of plugins is within Asset Manager, if you have some plugins already installed and there's a newer version of it, you can actually keep up with that newer version. Unlike user components, where you're not really going to be notified of that, Designer actually lets us know that you have a plugin that has some sort of update available. Right here next to plugins, I have a green dot with a 1 in it. That's letting me know I have one plugin currently that there is a newer version of that I can update. And up here, you have some tabs, the Browse, Installed Packages, and an Updates tab. If I select that, it will show me the exact file that I can update. Here, it's my design for Cinema. That should have been updated a long time ago. I didn't. It's as easy as just clicking the button, hitting Update, and now that plugin is at the newer version. Now, we have downloaded the Immersive Solstice Pod. Let's go to our plugins on the right-hand side. And a few drop-downs will show us Immersive and Solstice Pod. Drag that into your sources. Now, some of the positives for something like a plugin is the fact that, yeah, we can keep up with the newest version of it. Also, they are encryptable, and they are, for the most part, Q-SYS supported, so you can rely on them. Now, before we jump into any further information, let's take a look at our Immersive Solstice Pod. We have a few fields. We have a mode, discovered pods, this IP address and session key. That's going to be really useful for actually getting that wireless presentation going. So those fields will be something we want to share with our end user most likely. Now, before we move into the control side of all of this, there's one other thing I want to point out. You have the Asset Manager to find all these plugins, but there's actually one other place that you can get a lot of plugins or user components, and that is our communities website. You can get there by going to developers.qsys.com, and within that site you are going to have an Exchange tab, and that tab is going to give you a solid repository of plenty of Q-SYS supported user components and plugins, as well as community created user components and plugins. And so if you ever need an idea for something within your design, or you're looking for something very specific and you can't find it here within Asset Manager, I recommend going to Communities and seeing what they have there. Now, before we get into the next part of establishing the control over the displays and the wireless presentation device, there's one other thing I need to point out. We are most certainly going to be requiring a license within this design. We have the plugin and we have the UCI. We need a scripting license, and we'll certainly need the UCI deployment license.
Yeah, it's worth noting that different functionalities on your designs may require different licenses to be enabled on your cores. So if you're not familiar with the licensing model, be sure to check out, go to Q-SYS website /licensing. Take a look at the various licenses that are available that you might need for different types of things that are active in your design.
Yeah, in short, if you don't know about licenses, the dime tour is that since Q-SYS is a software-based platform, it can be expanded with licenses, and it also helps us keep the costs down for folks that don't want to use certain functionalities. If you don't need it in your system, then you don't have to buy the license. If you want it and you want to expand Q-SYS, you can do so.
Exactly. So now we know we have our plugins, we know we have our user component, and we know we have the licenses that we need to use for this design. So now we're going to get into the actual control part. We'll do that in the next video, so I will see you there.